yet. Oh, we have lots of people here. That's really cool. Okay. I just caught the end of the previous session, which sounded very interesting. I think we're going to get started straight away because we've got a really packed program, and I want to make sure that we have some time for conversation at the end. So this is a session about social inclusion and public participation, which is absolutely key to sustainable development, because if we don't have buy-in from our public, from our citizens, and if we don't include everybody, then I believe we can't really be sustainable. And as we have this conversation, I'd like you to think about who is the public, and particularly who's not in the conversation. And I was minded to remember my work with excluded young people. I spent my life working as an arts facilitator, largely with kids and young people who were excluded from education. And it was often because they were full of ideas. They were bright, they had lots of questions, but they couldn't really sit still, and they didn't really kind of fit into the classroom order. But often they would come up with the most brilliant solutions and fantastic innovative ideas. So I want you to think about who's not in the room, who are we excluding, and who is the public as we have this conversation. So the way this is going to work is going to be speakers are going to get 7 minutes. We're going to get messages when it's getting close to the end of your 7 minutes. Then we're going to have some responses from panelists, and then hopefully we get a discussion at the end of that. So the first person who I'm going to call is Gustav Stradanez, who is a senior advisor on governance and sustainability, working with Pure Consulting. He debuted with the UN and the environment in the 1970s through the Stockholm Conference for the Environment. And it's really amazing to think that was, going back 50 years. And now it's really come to the fore. He's stayed working in this arena ever since, disseminating information on and teaching about UN issues during the 80s and the early 90s. Has followed through and worked with the UN Commission for Sustainable Development since 1997, was the liaison officer between the UN and the NGO community at the UN headquarters in New York. So Gustav, I hope you're here. The floor is yours. I'm not sure he's made it.
I think he may be in the other room stuck still.
Hello, Derek.
Hello,
nice,
Julia.
Yeah, nice to see you. Well, I gave him a great introduction, didn't I? So when he arrives, we'll all be excited. Is Varalakshmi Vemuru in the room? I just need to check. Vara's. Yeah. Okay. I think because we don't want to waste time, we'll just move on. And then maybe Gustav will be with us shortly. So Varalakshmi Vemuru, I hope I've said that right, is practice manager at Social Sustainability and Inclusion Global Practice for Europe and Central Asia region for the World Bank. Has worked extensively in South Asia and Africa regions on social development issues, including women's empowerment, disability, addressing mental health issues, conflict, sensitive development, and social accountability. So Vara, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Julia, and what an opportunity to be here. So I'm kind of sharing a few views on what are the social dimensions of addressing urban forced displacement. So as we know, people are fleeing conflict, war, persecution, and some of them cross borders. They are refugees. Many stay within their country boundaries, and they are the internally displaced persons. Now, when you look at the numbers for June 2020, we had phenomenal number of people who are forcibly displaced, almost 79.5 million people. Almost 46 million of them were IDPs, 26 million refugees, and over 4 million asylum seekers. And of course, the Venezuelan conflict displaced more than 3.6 million people. The trend is not looking good. I mean, when you look at 2005 to 2020, IDPs increased by 5 times and refugees increased by 2 times. And I think what is very different now is people are not going back. So once they're displaced, they remain displaced. And there are at least 53 countries globally where people have remained displaced for over 10 years. So that's protracted displacement. Why the urban context? Almost 50% or more IDPs are in urban settings. You could look at Nigeria, Iraq, Ethiopia, Somalia, Syria as examples. And almost 60% of the refugees globally are in urban areas. I mean, you would know that almost 85% of Syrian refugees are actually in urban areas. Now, people displaced, I mean, the World Bank has been supporting this work on forced displacement and a development response to forced displacement, given the protracted nature of displacement. Most of the forcibly displaced in urban areas occupy very poor areas where the local communities are themselves poor, underserved, with very poor access to services and not many economic opportunities. They face social, cultural, and political barriers to any kind of integration. There are a lot of tensions, right? Competition for services, pressures, and many incidences of xenophobia and scapegoating, especially in the context of COVID. They are highly traumatized because of their movements. Many of them face disability. They don't have access to any networks, right? And so this puts them in a very vulnerable situation. And due to that, what we have seen is they generally remain hidden. They like anonymity. They don't want to be counted because then that exposes them. They are disproportionately poor and often are isolated, segregated, and unreached. So any attempt at bringing people together absolutely needs a whole of society approach, right? And these are there. So participatory processes need to be area-based so that everybody is part of the conversation. People need not identify themselves. Look at local economic development with a whole range of actors coming in from the private sector to the government. Look at options for collective action. And these platforms essentially need to provide the space for people to understand each other so that you can actually build the social fabric and kind of build social cohesion. Addressing gender dimensions are other very important. Gender-based violence in these areas against women and girls is very high. And the risk of youth getting into either being recruited for violent extremism are very high. So from the World Bank side, we're looking at a framework in urban settings. What does this look when we want to look at urban displacement? Whether you talk about safe and inclusive cities or competitive cities or resilient cities, social inclusion, participatory processes, and citizen engagement are fundamental. You could look at multiple dimensions, right? There's spatial, the infrastructure, services, land, economic and institutional, but at the end of it, the social and security implications and dimensions are central because we're dealing with people. So what we are proposing is a people in place approach where the interventions need to actually address the needs of the people, both the refugees, the host communities, and also migrants if they are there, needs a tailored approach to the individual needs, to the household needs, and to the community needs. And very critically, it also needs to look at the urban environment. I mean, what is the infrastructure available? What are the institutions that are there? And then it will need a tailored approach. So people in place approach is what we're proposing, with social and security issues being fundamental to how we address the issues of forced displacement in the urban settings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vera. That was really fantastic, really interesting, and mirrors a lot of the concerns and the work that I've been doing with City of Sanctuary, which is a wonderful British initiative. I'm just wondering if Jan has joined us yet. Is Jan Gustav in the room? Is he with us? I just need to check.
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Great to see you, Jan. Okay, I gave you, I already read out your biography, so everybody knows about your amazing work so far. So I'm just going to give you the floor straight away. You have about 7 minutes. Okay.
No, I'm sorry, but I was actually given 12 minutes. So my prepared statement on 12 minutes. It's in the program. So I hope I can do that.
Well, let's set off and see how we go. But
and can I share the screen as well?
If the technical team, if you can do that, and the technical team are there.
I hope so. The host has disabled participant screen sharing. I need that, otherwise my statement is sort of wasted.
I tell you what, Jan, if you can have a conversation with the technicians, I'm going to suggest that we go to the next speaker, okay?
That's fine.
Because we've got limited time. So if you talk to Evan and Alex, okay? So is Peter Williams here? Is Peter in the room? He was to be the next speaker. Yeah, Peter. Yeah, that's great. Okay, Peter. Peter's president of the International Institute of Rural Reconstruction. Which is one of the world's largest rural development organizations. He's received numerous recognitions for social innovation, including being cited by Forbes magazine as having one of the best 10 sustainability ideas on the whole planet. He's a DevEx 40 under 40 international development leader and was acknowledged as leading one of the most innovative social impact companies in the world by Fast Company. So Peter, we're really privileged to have you with us. You've got 7 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I will say that I had a challenge similar to Jan, that I did prepare a deck to share. But I suppose if people are okay with no images and just hearing me speak, I'm okay with that as well. The context for I guess my talk is around supply chains. You know, it's very possible that I'm a bit of an outlier in this audience, because I'm well aware that we are speaking in the context of the urban economy and all that that means and refers to. But I am perhaps one that perhaps describes himself today, at least, as an urbanist turned ruralist. Well, what does that really mean? You know, I spent the better part of about 10 to 15 years working on specific urban issues around the world, and particularly over the last 18 months, I've been really spending a lot of my focus around working with rural communities, particularly in Asia and Africa. And so to set the context for what I'll talk about over the next few minutes, it's really about supply chains. And I think more than ever, we're in a year, 2020, that has taught us many things, has introduced many aspects, many dimensions of our daily life and what it means to live, or what it means to be urban. And I think among the many issues that we've seen rise to the forefront has been the importance of supply chains. When we talk about the relevance in terms of what I've been doing, we see that rural-urban interdependence, right? So when I think about two of the leading industries today that are heavily reliant on not only labor, but resources from rural settings, those are food, and those are the automotive manufacturing sectors. So on the former, we see almost a $7.5 trillion industry in terms of food, and the automotive manufacturing, we see about a $3 trillion industry. It's really to be noted that both sectors, both industry, are very heavily reliant on obviously rural communities. We know that in our cities and towns around the world, roughly about 80 to 85% of global GDP is generated in cities and towns, and that's a data set that we're always very, very familiar. But I think what that sometimes masks is the heavily reliance that has on rural communities, on rural services that are either within the context of the rural geographies themselves, or provide the labor force and the resources that migrate to the cities and towns to generate that value. And that is certainly something that I would want to encourage our audience to continue to be mindful of, that sort of interdependence. So as I said, I had some images to kind of support the conversation, but I thought within this context it's really important to highlight the obvious. What are some of the lessons that we've learned from this pandemic? We're here in 2020, we're in October, we're still in it. So in many ways, we're very much experiencing the unintended consequences. And some of the things that jumped out from my perspective anyway, in terms of this interdependence, included the shortage of healthcare. It's no secret that rural communities have disproportionate amount of access to a number of things, not the least of which is health care. That ultimately has a bearing on not only life expectancy, but in the context of the pandemic, morbidity, mortality. But outside of the pandemic arena, we know that lack of access to basic resources sets rural communities, rural populations at a huge disadvantage. We also see the inadequate infrastructural links. So we're talking about road, the necessary services that connects and often bridges the opportunity to strengthen urban cities and towns. And so where there is underinvestment in these areas, we can ultimately see the impacts of that on our cities and towns in terms of the nature of services and the nature of labor that moves from rural to urban. I have two other areas, the prevalence of manual and on-site jobs. Well, one of the things that this pandemic has also exposed is the fact that if we follow the news anyway, we know that there are big tech companies that have been able to thrive in a space at a time when so many others aren't economically. And so these manual on-site jobs, which are in many cases factory work, manufacturing workers, we have seen a huge decimation of those kind of industries because these are not industries that can easily propel their labor force online. And that is in many cases very often reliant on the movement of rural migrant workers to cities and towns. And there are enough cases in the news that's documented the shift that has occurred as a result. I was going to talk about a case study in terms of East Africa and Southeast Asia. What we saw coming out of over the last several months, Olam, an agribusiness firm, did some research that showed that there was a huge change in fact, over half, 50% of farmers were experiencing shortages in food for obvious reasons, because in many parts of the world, there has been a tremendous lockdown. Well, that shortage of food is not only affecting farmers and their immediate households, but obviously the ability to then move those goods, those food produces to the neighboring towns and cities. And so we also have been seeing a huge effect on in terms of food shortages. Many of our cities and towns, whether or not those are in advanced economies or frontier markets or emerging markets, we are seeing and have seen over the past several months food shortages, price hikes. We know that in parts of the US, there's been a 300% increase in the level of hunger between 2019 and August 2020. And those figures really begin to just paint a snapshot or begin to highlight some of the reasons why, not surprisingly, we may be experiencing those sort of issues. Countries like South Africa, we're seeing food shortages going up by as much as 90%. So it's really, I suppose, a missed opportunity to somehow ignore the importance of the rural economy, opportunities for improving rural development as a means for ultimately improving and growing urban prosperity and urban life. And then my last point, not surprisingly, is around recommendations. And we think, at least from the position where I sit, that it's a four-pronged approach, that we need to really provide an inclusive environment for farmers, for rural households to thrive. We need to empower these communities, particularly women, to really support entrepreneurship. We need to ensure that there's a huge degree of agency and ownership on the part of rural communities, that they can really better understand the data and the landscape, physical and figural, that they're participating in. And obviously that we're creating and supportive of a regulatory framework that allows for rural community to really maximize their potential. Because ultimately we see the value as not being somehow limited to rural communities. We see it as very much, in fact, inextricably linked to the prosperity and growth of our urban economies. So I'll stop there. I'm well aware of time, and I hope we'll have the chance to interrogate this and other topics in the subsequent session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think you would have really liked our recent Collingwood Town Summit, because in the resolution there we talked about the importance of towns connecting rural areas to cities, that connectivity and those through routes. So I think you and I are on the same page. So now I think we're going to go back to Jan Gustav. Hopefully he's going to be able to screen share. Are you there, Jan?
I am, and let's try again. See if the techniques are on our side.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you, I need that. Let's see. And then, does that look like? Can you guys see it?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, that's great. Okay. So
okay.
Off go.
Does it move? Am I not able to control this? Yes, I am. So, okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and I am, of course, honored to be here. This will be a marathon run because I was given a bit more time, but I will try to stick to at least 7+. I'm not an urbanist. I am a historian with a degree in environmental sciences, and I also work on governance issues and the sustainable development goals. And if this thing here can move, it doesn't move for me. And the next one, please, if I am doing that. This is very slow. So I need to do this because so often we talk about the issues and talk about the problems. We seem to forget the background, which is incredibly pertinent to have in mind all the time. We need to remember, am I controlling the slides or not? We need to remember, as Rockström in University of Stockholm said, the lower level, the biosphere, is non-negotiable. Without nature, nothing exists. And the next slide, please. Remember what happened last year when the IPBES presented their fantastic overview. And next slide, please. They said basically that if we're not changing our ways of life and the way we work with environment everywhere, we can face the extinction of 1 million species. Next, please. So we actually understood a little while ago, actually people began talking about that in the 1960s, that the planet is sick and we need help. It needs help and we need help. Next, please. We've got the SDGs. Yes, the SDGs are there. And we tend to forget them. We tend to forget that the SDGs are part of a bigger plan. Next, please. And the bigger plan is called the 2030 Agenda. And so many people, delegates including, that work on this internationally and nationally, have never read that document. Paragraph 50 says very explicitly, we resolve to build a better future for all people, including the millions who have been denied the chance to lead decent, dignified and rewarding lives and to achieve their full human potential. And then the most astounding statement. We can be the first generation to succeed in ending poverty, just as we may be the last of a chance of saving the planet. Next, please. And again, whether you're an urbanist or a rural dweller or working in policy and politics, these are the four areas we need to remember. There is a declaration in the 2030 agenda, then you got the 17 SDGs, then you got a chapter on means of implementation and the follow-up and review. And next, please. And the interlinked nature, which is so often forgotten in municipal issues, where I have been advising people on sustainable issues. They said, we can't do all 17. We'll pick up a few. And that's the biggest mistake we do. We need to have a conceptual yes, come on, next one, please. A conceptual understanding that they're all 17 in our head at every minute of our planning and working. No cherry picking, everyone must be involved, and we must strive to succeed. Next, please. And there is another thing which we tend to forget, and that is actually viewed very well through the United Nations system. The Global 2030 Sustainable Development Portfolio is an organic agenda, and it keeps expanding and deepening. And all these elements that come out of this, all the agreed documents with a knowledge base, need to be included as we go along and trying to figure out what is all happening around us. On the left-hand side of the column, it says agreed and operationalized, and I've only taken out a few of the key elements that is actually part of the 2030 Sustainable Development Portfolio. On the right-hand side, all the conferences that are going to expand further on what we are dealing with. Next, please. Next, please. So we've got the knowledge, we have the tools, we have the money, don't discuss that. The question is, do we have the answers? Next, please. And the answers is always included in attention, which is actually in our mind and also in the 2030 agenda. On the left-hand side, you have the traditional business approach, the triple bottom line called people, planet, and profit. On the right-hand side, you have the 5 Ps of the sustainability agenda: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And juxtapose profit to prosperity, and we have an interesting discussion going, which is not resolved. Next, please. So do we understand everything we need to understand? Next, please. Next, thank you. We have read about this GSDR, the Global Sustainable Development Report, a report given to the High-Level Political Forum last year by a number of scientists. They talk about interconnections. They talk about actions in one country or in one urban area, leaving negative footprints across the entire planet if we do not see the interconnections. Next, please. And they talk about interrelationship, where we have a tendency to maximize immediate returns while ignoring longer-term consequences. We need to holistically integrate all the SDGs. This is a very, very potent document. And again, I'm surprised to ask people who are in the midst, either be that urbanist or nationalist, do you understand and do you know these things? And I said, what is that document? Next, please. So I've done an overview of how the different stakeholders are prepared on local, national, and regional level. This is based on my work with delegates over the past 4 years at the High-Level Political Forum and in regions. And you can see that when you talk about government and business, they're high on almost every level, be that influence or interest. If you look at civil society and NGOs, it's not a very good position. Next, please, and you'll see the same tendency here when you come to ability to implement or preparedness. And this is absolutely dramatic because the 2030 agenda says almost in every paragraph, people need to be involved if we're going to make this happen. People, civil society, non-state stakeholders need to be involved, and they are not really there yet. Next, please. So this is at the crux of social inclusion and public participation. At the High-Level Political Forum every year, there is a voluntary national report by countries. More than 200 such reports have been delivered since 2016. Next, please. These reports reveal something interesting. There are different qualities. On the top level, I point to the fact that Some countries have just established a body to report on what they've done on this particular year. These reports are very low in substance. Then there are countries with a coordinating body, and they have more substance to it. But the third one, where you see countries with a holistic national strategy for sustainable development with a multi-stakeholder consultation process, that's where you have real public participation. And these reports are also substantive. Next, please. What is the problem with sustainable development? Well, a very interesting report came out having looked at the sustainable development issues over 30 years, and they say that on the left-hand side, sustainable development has finally reached political legitimacy, but there is a tendency to think about sustainable development in either one or two issues. One, efforts are made to adapt development, thinking to sustainable development and tick boxes, or two, develop two strategies, one based on traditional development thinking and one on sustainability. In both cases, sustainable development is given the lower priority. So we're far from reaching the situation where we want to be. Next, please. This is an overview that the UNHLPF did, and they show that only 44% of all the countries in the world have a national coordination body. And that is a long way to go to 2030. Next, please. So then there is something about governance, and I could say public participation. Next, please. Public participation relies on good governance. Apply that and you have participation. Next, please. So what is governance about? Well, over time, since 1945 until now, 75 years after UN was founded, justice has evolved. It's justice and peace, justice and rights, justice and law, and justice and sustainable development, leading us to leaving no one behind. And this is an excellent book that I think everyone should read. Next, please. Social inclusion, what is it? According to the World Bank, it's the process of improving the terms of which individuals and groups take part in society, improving the ability, opportunity, and dignity of those disadvantaged. No, it cannot only be the disadvantaged, it needs to be all. Because look at this, unless government own intergovernmental processes, policies will never be taken seriously. And unless people feel ownership with development, little if anything will be implemented. And the SDGs invite us to do that. Next. With public participation, we want agenda setting, content provision, provide process, timely resolutions, real documentation, relevance in reports, reviews, outcomes, proper implementation, and partnerships. Next. And with public participation, we need availability, access, information, transparency, accountability, participation, lobby opportunities, decision shaping and making, impact, and expediency. Next, please. Which is the most important issue relating to participation? Well, next, please, and I will say something about that. Is it access or accountability? And in what context? Next, please. Trust is key in every governance context. And if you go back to the UN Charter, in the preambular text, trust is outlined in this way. I won't read it because I want next slide, please. One of the most interesting person in the world today that's dealt with trust is Honora O'Neill. And let me quote her. What would it take for us to have forms of accountability that allow people to make intelligent and informed judgments about where to place their trust? Measurements is informative only when applied to things that can be measured. Spurious precision leads to bogus accountability. Can we hold professionals to account without inventing illusory methods of accounting? On the basis of serious accountability is experience, independence, and good communication. We need to consider which forms of accountability are needed to support which relations of trust and which professional standards. If we don't answer these questions, public participation is absolutely not interesting. Does governance direct reality? Yes. But monitoring indicators, are they relevant? Whose interest do they reflect? And who developed the indicators? On which values are the indicators based? Collective goods, society's goods, monetary values, right-based systems? There are so many questions we need to answer when we talk about a social inclusion and participation. Next, please. To accomplish all this, we need a new conceptual thinking. And the lower part there says effective and relevant governance must reflect the 9 dimensions that are listed in the 2030 agenda. Next, please. 1, we have 3 elements called integrated, interlinked, and indivisible. Next, Then we have universal, people-centered, and planet-sensitive. Next, we have social, economic, environmental dimensions. And when you put this together in the next slide, and you think about this at the simultaneous time, you have what you call transformative sustainable development. Next, please. In conclusion, next, please. Social exclusion is multidimensional. Social inclusion is defined as the process of improving the terms of participation in society, particularly for people who are disadvantaged. But, next, please. Measuring social inclusion is challenging due to its multidimensional nature and the lack of standard data, while inclusion is a core aspiration of the 2030 Agenda. Conceptual and analytical work on what constitutes inclusion, as well as efforts to improve data availability are needed. If you can't have all these elements, it is actually illusory to talk about public participation or social inclusion. Even in the most dictatorial regimes, we have what's called symbolic public participation. And the next, please. Next, please. Good governance, public participation, and social inclusion in the context of the 2030 Agenda and within an urban setting. Why not? If there could be a C40 of cities, then form a C40-like organization for developing urban sustainable development strategies and plans based on good governance, social inclusion, using the 9 dimensions of the 2030 Agenda as conceptual thinking basis. Cities, big cities, do not have to go through the rigmarole of national governments and parliaments. So let me finish this by saying we've changed the world in the wrong direction by mistake. We can save it and make it better by intent. As a historian, I can say we've come a long way in a short period of time. As an environmentalist, I say we haven't come far enough. So please move forward. And the next, let me just emphasize the fact that optimism is the fuel of heroes, the enemy of despair, and the creator of the future. And the last one, please. All of these are available if you want them. Call me, talk to me. Thank you so much for listening and being patient with my erratic behavior.
Fantastic, Jan Gustav. I'm so glad we were able to have you do that. I know it was at breakneck speed, but to see the slides and to hear you speak about that and take us on a really important learning journey was I feel privileged. Thank you. We're going to move to Circe Montero, who's professor of the University of Pernambuco in Recife. Director of the Research and Innovation for Cities department there, works in interdisciplinary approaches, has been engaged in studies on resilience and urbanization of poor settlements, engaged in cross-cultural investigations of place experiences and the spatial logic of urban criminality. So Circe, the floor is yours.
Oh, yeah. I have a presentation also. I don't know if it is ready. Hello?
Yes, Circe, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Is someone in charge of the presentation?
Yes, just one moment, please. Circe, could we suggest you to send us your file, and then while we do that, we'll move on to the next speaker and then get us.
Oh, I sent the file previously.
Okay, I think. Circe, I think because we have limited time, I'm just going to ask Derek Gibson if he will speak now, and maybe our technical team will see if they can sort out the issues. Okay, but it's good to see you here. Okay, so I'm very pleased to present Derek Gibson, Councillor of Oshawa, Canada. We've been working together for nearly a year, involved in the Urban Economy Forum last October. So Derek's a public servant. He's been putting into practice his belief for over a decade about building a better Oshawa. He's working in leadership roles, advancing positive change, and being very effective in that role. So Derek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to give this screen share a try and see if it works for me. Looks like it's working. Can someone nod for me just so that I know that it's, thank you, Jan Gustav. So
yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to get started here. So as mentioned, I have the privilege for the last 2 years of representing the citizens of Ward 4 in the city of Oshawa in Ontario, Canada. I'm also currently the board president at a place called the Backdoor Mission for the Relief of Poverty, and that's going to be important context to what I'm going to be sharing today, because I'm going to be sharing a ground experience that we have had and then bring that back up to the general. But just for those geographically who want to orient yourselves, there's North America. The red dot in the middle is roughly where Oshawa is located on the northwest shore of Lake Ontario. Geographically, we're about a 45-minute drive or a 1-hour train ride east of the city of Toronto. Since a lot of people know where Toronto is, it's easiest to orient ourselves for an international audience that way. And today I'm going to be focusing on bringing the context of our experience to both the Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is to make cities inclusive, safe, those two being quite particular to my context, resilient and sustainable, as well as the Urban Economy Forum 2020 Theme 6, which is social inclusion and public participation, and especially the social inclusion element. So the city of Oshawa, right in the middle there, this is 40 years ago in 1980, income disparity, if you will, far more egalitarian. 40 years ago, the red areas are lower income areas. I'm standing right now right in the middle of that smaller red box in the middle, right in downtown Oshawa. And you zoom ahead 20 years to the year 2000, and you see that income disparity in our region starts to widen. And even further so, this is coming up to 15 years ago. And it, in terms of urban poverty, other factors like addiction, mental health challenges, and so forth, lower income areas, and this is zooming it in. It's a bit of a grainy photo. This gives you a little bit of an idea of the changes over 40 years. And so just to bring us into a 2020 context, pre-coronavirus, we were already dealing with a historic housing crisis, and it was 30 years in the making. In Canada, from the 1960s to the mid-1990s, as this graph shows, this is the units built in our region in particular, but this graph extrapolates out really nationwide in terms of all of the units that were being built, and then suddenly it dried up. And now we, in terms of the context, there's a housing crisis, widening socioeconomic gap in our city in particular, manufacturing, flight, shifting economy, and of course an opioid crisis that has hit us in the downtown of Oshawa harder than most areas, but certainly has been on par with other urban areas in Canada. So the Backdoor Mission is a very low barrier access point in our downtown for people who are on the margins. It is located in the back of a 153-year-old church, but it's a non-religious organization. It's very inclusive in its orientation. This is pre-coronavirus. You can see that it was very much a community hub for these individuals. But then in the context of the pandemic, that was taken away because we couldn't gather in large groups. What we did in response was we brought together many different service provider partners. So you see a whole list here: healthcare, primary care, mental health, addiction services, harm reduction, community-based healthcare, to offer everything under one roof. And it has had a very successful outcome for this population. You're not really going to see client pictures in here. We try to avoid showing too many of those pictures, but you do see some of the activities in the facility. We see over 200 meals given out every day, and we see much access to primary care, mental health services, addictions. There's rest areas, mental health counselors, And despite the pandemic itself, we've seen that this has been a very successful centralized model of delivery that we hope to maintain post-pandemic. So just to speak to the factors of the success, how this came together very quickly. The first was that it was already a pre-existing trusted community space. It was low barrier. There were already concurrent separate pre-existing discussions. So we were already looking at the mission. Other organizations were looking at co-locating services prior to the pandemic. So this really accelerated those discussions. The partner openness to models of collaborative community-centric care. So being willing to get out of the siloed reality. As well as, very importantly here, and this is in the context of today's conversation, the reversal of expectations from conventional care delivery, where instead of people having to go to get these services, it's embedded in and part of their community. And also there was the political push in the community behind the initiative. So in this context of the Sustainable Development Goal, Sustainable SDG, I got that backwards, 11, and our theme 6 today, really importantly, this effort that we have undertaken, where people are finally seeing a doctor or a nurse, where people are finally getting on addictions management programs and medications, where people are finally speaking with a mental health counselor, they're finally getting on to disability support programs because they had been in more fragmented sort of a reality. We're now seeing that they are being able to have that social inclusion and access to services. It is inclusive. It's also safe, and they feel safe in that context. Sometimes in other service locations, they don't feel safe or included, so they don't even access the services. So this is sort of the roundup here in terms of the experience. What we've been learning through this and the important factors that are learnings that go beyond just this location. The barriers to services, access for marginalized populations, urban economies, and urban scale, there's a tendency to create barriers, to become lost in that scale. There's also the public financial resources, though. This model is less costly than the costs of meeting people who are vulnerable at moments of peak crisis. So when you have to send an ambulance, send them to the hospital, or policing, or other emergency services, it's cheaper to do it this way than it is to do it that way. It reduces social stressors between different social groups. And one of the notes that I want to make here is that care, and this is my last slide, so I'll be wrapping up momentarily. Care must be taken in the impetus to quantify, to measure, to codify. It can be done, but it can also create additional barriers. Priority has to be on meeting individuals in their current circumstance and think about those unmeasurable elements. So things like trust, community and social fabric, dignity, and so forth. Horizontal solution making as much as possible rather than institutionally imposed from above. And service providers can't just commit to building grand institutions. We have to look at models that are often instead of the unreachable models, ones that commit to going to those populations and embedding them in their communities, especially as urban areas grow. And I will wrap up there, seeing that as I've just gone over the 7-minute mark. So thank you so much for listening. Look forward to the further discussion.
Thank you very much, Derek. That's really great. I'm going to go back now and ask if Circe's managed to get her screen sharing sorted out. Are we good to go?
Hi, I just shared the presentation to Evan.
Let's see, hopefully, crossing my fingers.
Yes, sorry, I see it now. I'm opening it up. Okay, perfect.
Okay, thanks very much, Evan. We have a fantastic technical team here working really hard to ensure that we can all communicate with each other.
So it's, okay.
Anyway, I could start presenting. What? Yes, here we are.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm very pleased to present our experience to transform public spaces. And we were really worried also with the speed of the transformation as well. And the next, please. So I'm sharing the experience of a team in Recife, Brazil, northeast of Brazil, And this project, it was a very interesting partnership between the academia, the federal university, and the local government. Please. And it is an estuary. It's a very water-centric city. And this is the Capibaribe River. It divides the city into a rich part, middle-class neighborhood, and a lower part. It's a very poor part of the city, low-income settlements. So the river is really a social divide. And our challenge was to devise an ecological corridor across the whole river and to establish a system of public parks alongside the both margins. And that was really, the next place. That was really interesting because this is a project ongoing from the last 7 years. So we spent nearly 3 years in studies, field work, and working to devise a long-term vision of the city. And the most important thing for us was to have a very clear idea of the future vision of the city, an idea that could be easily shared for everybody in the city. So we came across, after so many events and discussion, with this image of a city park. And the Capibaribe River here is the image of the river as a corridor connecting public spaces and neighborhoods of the city. Next, please. But at the same time, this is some numbers. The project impact more or less 1/3 of the city. Next, please. Because what I really want to talk is not about the project, but the process. So here we start with this negotiation. The university-led project start with this huge image. The second guy is our mayor, and open a dialogue with stakeholders, communities, and start in establishing partnership with all the groups alongside the river. Next. And for doing that, we discovered that Facebook, Instagram now can be considered tools of urban planning, because we have a very strong communication with all these people. We made children, elderly, women, everybody part negotiate the idea of how to make this project, how to developing this project in the city. Next, please. You can go to the next one. Here are some informal vendors. And this is the more or less the idea of prototyping public space. We came from research and not only academic knowledge, but also traditional knowledge. And we came with a group of alternative solutions choices, from the most realistic to the more dreaming ones. And we call people to come occupy the place and think with us. So we came to, for example, this is the project of the Baobab Garden. It was an empty land with this huge baobab. We invite people from a Sunday picnic in the place, and they just come bringing plants, yoga mats, and children, and music, and occupying and testing solution, where we are going to put the benches, the table, what we're going to do in the tree shadows. But the most important thing is that we learned that this kind of prototyping build up affection, not only with the place, but affection between the people involved in the process. Different from other participatory process, when you come together in the same place, you have people from the periphery, middle class, older people, women, and they don't want to come together, they want to work with the other people in the same space. Next, please. And so we put a lot of effort in what we call urban activation. So it was research, solutions, conception, and activation to make the place transform and be used. So it's a hands-on solution. We invite next, please. And sometimes we build ephemeral structures. Sometimes we have a series of events. Sometimes we have a more daring structure, involving more or less people, money, local or global. There were many kinds of prototyping places. Next, please. children. We also always have to have children in all this process, because when you have children involved, everybody starts really thinking to whom we are building this city. Next. And what we discover in our contest, that is Latin American contest, I have to tell you so, that we really to have a very clear challenge. We have to provide this interaction and the social friction of all these people in the same place, to have this diversity. And so what we have is not a conflict, but is a resolution of conflicts, it's the recognition of differences. And the emergence of this affective and pride were very important drives for people to keep coming and to keep interested in the project. And most of all, to finish, in all this prototyping experience, next, we have to have fun. All the prototyping finished in party, music, dancing. Come on, we are the land of the carnival. That is a very important part of any kind of social inclusion. And to end it up my presentation, I would like to share some lessons. The next, please, is the last one, I think. That first, because the project was led for the university and not linked to any political party, we managed to have a trust for all the players in the project. That was very difficult for the local government, especially in a place when we have this polarized political situation. So that gives us a very incredible situation and possibility to articulate different stakeholders. Second, prototyping space is an innovative way to design, but it can see also a city being by craftsmanship. And this is very important in this moment, post-pandemia, when we have to redefine the way we use the space. We have to redefine our way of consumption and how we make the city. So this prototyping that we used for the last 5 years were really important for that. And as I complained, governments are really still very much interested in the projects because they want the project under their hands to sell, to get funds, rather than in the process. And for us now, for example, the great importance to have this huge and massive involvement. We have this problem of alternation of power in local government. Every 4 years, we change the government, and the next government dismissed all the projects developed for the previous one. So long-term project with inclusion and environment can only be led forward if we have a very strong engagement of the population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ceci. It was great to hear you talk about fun and the importance of having children involved. We're going to move straight now to Paige. I hope Paige is in the room. She's the assistant professor at San Francisco State University, been working in sustainable tourism. Yeah, so I think we all like to be tourists, don't we? But Paige, you're an expert in this, so the floor is yours.
Definitely. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate being invited here, and I'm excited to listen to the speakers share their research and stories, because I see a lot of linkages between the research and work that I have done. Julie started out asking, who is not in the room, when we talk about inclusion and bringing various stakeholders together. And oftentimes as we think of stakeholders, the universities, as Circe kind of pointed out, are not often looked at as a stakeholder group that should be engaged. And to Circe's point about being a neutral party, I think that making sure that the university is engaged in research with the community not only involves students and young people, but offers that perspective that there's some neutrality where individuals who typically wouldn't come to the table to speak together are more willing to do so. So Like Peter, I'm a little bit opposite. I actually work primarily with rural communities in finding ways to kind of reimagine the rural economy with mechanization. A lot of rural communities, jobs have gone elsewhere. So I worked for a decade in Eastern North Carolina and worked with rural communities in identifying ways that they could create jobs in those communities around tourism. So tourism being the focus of that. I came to San Francisco in 2018. So now obviously I'm in an urban setting, but the core of what sustainable tourism is, and the Global Sustainable Tourism Council created criteria for tourism businesses and destinations, and it really is based on the Sustainable Development Goals. So this idea of addressing economic, environmental, and societal dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals are embedded in sustainable tourism. So coming to a city from a rural setting, I thought that it would be a big change, but really that hasn't been the case because sustainable tourism requires working directly with and engaging community stakeholders, and that doesn't differentiate between urban and rural settings. I believe sustainable tourism has the potential to link conservation and nature with the well-being of local communities. It has a number of positive benefits, including revenue generation, cultural preservation, and capacity building, while contributing to the community development and poverty reduction. So this idea of a balanced, healthy economy is really about generating jobs related to tourism. And when we talk about empowering women and youth, there are a lot of opportunities available in tourism. I recently attended the Global Youth Economic Opportunities Summit, and they pointed out this fact that tourism is a non-linear career pathway model. So it offers job opportunities to individuals who may not have high skill level, but they're able to still move up the ladder and receive training on the job. Tourism offers innovation as far as innovative entrepreneur opportunities. So if you're talking about poverty reduction, having some kind of a job training facility in a location might help to actually create jobs for individuals. Focusing on what's unique about the places that we're at. So in San Francisco, obviously we have a pretty sophisticated tourism system, but the number of tourists that come into San Francisco, they're going to go to the traditional sites, right? So you're going to have large number of people, large capacity in certain areas. So in partnership with the university, San Francisco Travel, which is the destination marketing organization for the city of San Francisco, we work together to try and identify ways to get tourists into the outlying areas so that we could kind of spread that wealth in terms of tourism and open up opportunities for some of those communities that they aren't thought of when people come into the area. So we worked, the university partnered with the DMO, and students were engaged in this process where we go into a community and work with the stakeholders, including the local business organizations, associations that they have there. We work with the local businesses, the residents of those communities to identify what are the assets in that area and kind of creating a tourism offering in that area or neighborhood. So it's extending tourists out into neighborhoods that aren't traditionally visited and offering opportunities for those areas. So the students get training for how to promote San Francisco. They create events where the students and businesses are welcome into these communities. It's called a passport event. So they'll go in and get to visit with the different areas, and individuals can promote travel into those communities. So it's kind of enhancing the historic areas and some of the resources that aren't most often visited, and expanding, stimulating the local economy in some of those areas. So I think it's important that we do, in terms of the economic, environmental, and societal dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals that we do work with stakeholders, including the university and young people, as a means of bringing more jobs and preserving the areas of some places. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to having more discussion on the panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Paige. The next person I'm going to call to speak is Rashi Mehra, who is a Senior Associate for the Academic and Research Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Her research focuses on urban inequalities and activism, urban planning, informal work and gender. She's creating research on social movements to support the work of activists and practitioners who engage with marginalized urban geographies, anchoring a city-level campaign on making the next Delhi master plan more inclusive for populations left out of conventional planning paradigms. And she's also working on international labour organisation supported study for understanding paid and unpaid domestic work. Rashi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So really close to midnight where I am right now in New Delhi, but I'm very excited to be here. So I've heard so much in the last 5 hours about inclusive participation, how important it is that citizens be heard in how they want to shape their city. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to be speaking about my experiences of anchoring the city-level campaign called Main Bhi Delhi, which literally translates into I am Delhi too, and which is the campaign really started in 2018, and it's a collection of civil society organizations, activists, researchers, architects, urban planners, just general citizens who have come together to sort of understand what urban planning means in the city of New Delhi, and to kind of make the next master plan, which is going to be released early next year, which is the 2041 master plan. 2041 so it's going to essentially shape the next 20 years of the city. And that's what we're working on. So when we started doing this work in 2018, we realized that urban planning, the language of it is quite challenging and it's quite thick. I mean, I'm a trained geographer with a love for maps, but even when I looked at the Delhi master plan, I was like, yeah, what is happening here? Like, it's incredibly technocratic. The language is just, it's not something that anybody who's not trained to be an urban planner or an architect, they won't get it. So what we started with was really listening to people and saying, how do we go about this? Also, the idea of urban planning in India, in the Indian context, the way it is taught, architecture is taught, urban planning is taught, is still very Western. So it's sort of like global north glamming onto a southern city, and just has no sort of logic, so it has too much of a formal logic in a city which is built really the heart of which is informality. Can I have the next slide, please? So the focus of the campaign for us was informal livelihoods. So construction workers, domestic workers, home-based workers, waste pickers, street vendors, informal housing. So people who live in what are called slums or resettlement colonies, people who are homeless in the city, on gender, and on climate change and sustainability. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, if you could wait, if you could look at one of our posters from the campaign. So this was the kind of active participatory research that we went on to do. So housing rights activists went to every informal settlement in the city, and we mapped it on Google Map. And then we measured the area that it was under. And you could see that 0.6% of Delhi's land is under what are informal settlements. Whereas if you just take an average car size is what we did, and we multiplied it with the number of cars in the city, and 2% of Delhi's land is under parked cars. So it was participatory research like that really sort of allowed us to really understand, what the urban fabric of Delhi looks like and where the challenge lies when we plan it in this sort of, in a way that just like I said, belies, just doesn't look at the logic, the informality that exists in a city like New Delhi and other cities in the global south. Next slide, please. So essentially, the campaign started to talk, and we all sort of would get together and have a lot of conversations in understanding how can we move the plan beyond tokenistic representations. It's all well and good to say women need to be included or they should be gender inclusive cities, but how do you go about building it? Because I'm a woman, citizen of New Delhi, and my needs are very different from, say, a woman who works as a street vendor in the city. So women are not a homogeneous group, neither are young people, so how do you kind of have those conversations and look at the kind of intersectionalities that exist? And it has been quite a challenge. We've gone through multiple rounds of consultations with different stakeholders. So we had people who were differently able to come in for consultations. And it was the very first time that, at least in my experience, we had to get sign language interpreters to be able to do that, because it's not very prevalent in India, not very prevalent in Delhi. And so this kind of research, participatory research that we have produced, and I would really invite you all to look at our website, which is called Maybe Delhi, where we've kind of put out everything that we've done, every fact sheet, which breaks down exactly what the needs of particular stakeholders are in a city who are left out of planning exercises, and then kind of input into what the master plan can do for them. Next slide, please. So 2020, next slide, please. Yeah, 2020 won't be complete if we don't talk about COVID. So, I mean, essentially what happened in Delhi was that we saw mass migration. People started walking out of the city because there was just not enough money to pay the rent to survive in a city like New Delhi, which is fairly expensive. Not, of course, according to London or Canada standards, but expensive nevertheless. There was food insecurity, health insecurity, income insecurity, and housing precarity. But what it did was it exposed what we as a campaign had been talking about all along. So this is something that we've heard again and again today, that Corona or COVID has not exposed something new. I mean, it has only sort of exposed a system which was already broken, already under a lot of stress. So when we talk about affordable housing in the campaign, when we talk about migrant housing, migrant hostels, which are cheap, affordable, sustainable, the words are coming from the people themselves, and that's not always easy. And further, the connection that we make then is to say to an urban planner who doesn't understand many of these issues, to kind of say, well, this is the challenge of auto construction, this is the challenge of informality that exists in our city, and this is how we can sort of make sure that everybody's included, in the pattern of the city. Next slide, please. It's World Homeless Day on, I think, 10th of October. And therefore, I wanted to share something from our fact sheet on homelessness. So this is something that we've put together. This is research that the campaign has done and created. It says 59% of Delhi's shelter homes do not have provisions for bathrooms. So this is at a time when, and I'm also sort of saying this because India went under one of the world's strictest lockdowns early in our Corona sort of fight for Corona, which said everybody had to be home. There was massive curfews. But what do you do for people who don't have homes, right? So you have shelter homes where only 59% of them have provisions for a bathroom, which means when Corona, we say it's very easy to save yourself if you just wash your hands. That's not something that's available to most citizens of Delhi, because forget homeless people, even many people who live in informal settlements don't have access to piped water. So 7% provide kitchens, 18% are friendly for disabled, differently able people. So again, this is when it is the campaign in the last 2 years, what I've learned is, both as a practitioner and then as a researcher now and as an advocate for building inclusive cities, is that it takes a lot of time. We took 2 years to come up to now where we speak to the National Institute of Urban Affairs, which is drafting the master plan. And we can give them something that is truly conclusive from our side, because we've spoken to thousands of people during the course of this campaign and said, tell us exactly what your needs from the city are. And we have of course kept the focus very, very sort of sharp on informality, where we've said that, you know, a university kid in Delhi can probably get in and have computer access and maybe attend some of the workshops that the National Institute of Urban Affairs and the Delhi Development Authority host, and they can say, okay, this is what I need from the city. But a kid who lives on the urban periphery, away from these things, away from an internet connection, or there's massive technology gaps, their voices are not heard. So it's easy to say participatory planning. We've been doing it for the last 2 years in New Delhi, and it's been exciting and it's been challenging. But I mean, I want to say it is possible, but we will see how much of what we are saying is actually going to be taken into the master plan. But in the meantime, we've created these resources, which I feel any city around the world can replicate. It is about anchoring and holding space for many different voices. So these are just my sources from where I've taken some of the things, and yeah, that's what I wanted to present, and I'm happy to take Q&A, and of course send you guys off to our website again, which is stated here, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on very quickly because we're over time. Our next speaker is Hawa Diallo, Chief of Partnership at UN at the UN, with 30 years UN experience. I think that's correct. I don't know, this is the notes I've got here, but particularly work in peacekeeping, which I think is really important, particularly as Gustav talked about the importance of peace. So Hawa, I'm going to give the floor to you now.
Sure. Hi. How's everybody doing? So really happy to be here. Hawa Diallo beaming in from New York City at the UN HQ. I hope I have my volume on. I hope so. Am I being heard by everybody?
Yes, I can hear you and see you. So
awesome,
please continue.
In this time of virtual experiences, every virtual event is a new reality. So happy to be here, and you know, this event is really special to me, really close to my heart. I started my professional career in UN Habitat, working on partnerships and youth issues and local government capacity building. So I really want to congratulate all the participants, all the speakers in doing this event. You know, I really have seen the sort of unstoppable commitment of all the stakeholders for more inclusive, healthy, and sustainable urban settlements. It's really been really great hearing innovation that's fresh, you know, from the ground, based on solutions in support of the new urban agenda. Now, this year has made us really, you know, rethink the way we work, and it's certainly shaped our strategies to provide adequate housing for all, amongst other things that are apparent working with urban issues. The pandemic really has exposed the most vulnerable urban communities, as many people have mentioned, to many more unprecedented challenges. So, you know, how do we respond, you know, to these real life challenges? From the experience that I really got from UN Habitat and endured to this day, it's taught me the importance of, you know, meeting communities where they are, a focus on local to local dialogues, which is something that really Habitat does very well. In the time I was in UN Habitat, I worked very actively in informal settlements of Kibera, in Mathare, also really on UN Habitat, really was able to demonstrate a lot of grassroots projects in the various regions. You know, so as we discuss in this session about social inclusion and public participation, we have to really consider every aspect and of the most vulnerable groups, the urban poor, indigenous people, women, youth groups. And, you know, these people, segments of society that are most affected, especially in urban settings. As we all know, around the screen, cities and towns have great potential to provide, you know, adequate housing and safe spaces for women and young people and other stakeholders so they can thrive in their respective settings. However, when we design these spaces, I think it's critical that we have to have a deep understanding of the needs of each community. You know, I'm speaking from the perspective of UN civil society engagement, which is the work that I am focused in now. And I strongly believe that NGOs and other actors within civil society, of course, working in partnership with other groups, are necessary to realize the realities of the urban sector and the new urban agenda. So we have to, you know, we need to listen. We need to highlight the work of every actor within the various communities. I've mentioned some of the ones, but, you know, I focus a lot in civil society and also, you know, in terms of girls and other marginalized areas. Working in the Department of Global Communications here in New York, we try to give special emphasis to these stakeholders towards the achievement of the global goals or the sustainable development. But again, for us, with specific reference to SDG 11. Now, you know, COVID, as we said, has really given us an opportunity to reimagine, to really reflect on what we're doing for us here on the urban agenda. I know that everybody across the stream knows, across these screens, is aware more than anybody else, all the latest data by UN Habitat or other international organizations on adequate housing. You know, over the next 15 years, we know that it's estimated that more than 3 billion people will need adequate housing. And this really directly affects women and young people. We know data that, you know, young people are living more and more in cities where unemployment and poverty really has become really great obstacles, you know, that they have to face. Cities, you know, have to see these obstacles even, you know, more than all of us. For instance, you know, coming from the continent, I'm aware that for Africa, you know, some cities in Africa are composed of over 70% under the age of 30. And that's something that really speaks to me and gives me sort of that momentum for the youth leadership and the youth empowerment work that I actually started out in UN Habitat, working in you know, informal settlements of Kibera and Mathare. Now, 2030, the global goals, the SDGs, it's barely 10 years remains for us to achieve this lofty goals by the deadline. So definitely there's an urgent need for us to step up in every way, whether it's governments, local, central, whether it's the UN, whether it's grassroots, whether it's, you know, IGOs. More than ever, we all need to sign on to the UN Decade of Action to deliver the SDGs by 2030. You know, and I mention that because you asked the question, you know, who is in the room? You know, this is a webinar, so I've been thinking, who is in this room? You know, who's there? I'm looking across the screen and I see fellow, you know, experts, fellow UN people. And I'm asking myself, you know, where are the young people? And I'm so glad the colleague that mentioned children. You know, do we have any grassroots people here? Are there any indigenous people here, indigenous women? Are there any faith groups here? Definitely faith-based groups are working on urban issues, you know, as really first responders. What about the villagers and the farmers? I'm from Sierra Leone. Is anybody here from Pujon, Sierra Leone, from my mom's village? You know, we talk about the rural-urban divide. Where are the community leaders? For me, these are all the people who need to be in the room. And also, for me, you asked the question, you know, who's the citizen, who's the public? I think at one point or another, all of us are citizens, all of us are the public. You know, I'm a UN worker in this situation, but if I go into another environment, I would be considered the public. So we all have a stake. It's not only the city planners or the decision makers that have to have a sense of urgency to act, to change, and to do whatever is necessary to embark on partnerships, you know, for you know, local solutions. But it's all of us. It's the citizens. It's the housewife in Valhalla, Westchester, where I live, or the housewife in a village in South Africa that needs to be included. So that's a really very important question that we always have to carry with us within our work. Who is in the room? Who is in our project? You know, how are we including those voices unheard voices, or the voices that are not visible, who can't make it to a conference room in the Economic and Social Council in New York, or to the Gigiri complex in one of the gorgeous rooms that they have there. But I think also the accountability and the responsibility doesn't only rest with us. I think these stakeholders also have a responsibility. It's a two-way accountability. I think for us at the UN and for big organizations, you know, given the context of the shrinking civic space, there are things that we have to do. There are platforms that we have to make available. For example, World Bank is in the process right now in the midst of the Civil Society Policy Forum. That is something that everybody should be aware of. World Bank has embraced and brought civil society into the World Bank, as opposed to having them outside demonstrating. In the Department of Global Communications, we have the UN Civil Society Conference. The last one was held in Salt Lake City in the United States, Utah. And whenever I mention that, people ask, Utah, why Utah? Because we have to be there. We can't always be in places where, you know, we're speaking to the choir, where we're loved. We have to be in places where people question what is the UN and what the UN is doing. In Salt Lake City, we had over 5,000 people who attended. 40% of those people were young people from around the world, ages 18 to 32. And of course, how can I not mention the World Urban Forum? That is something that I lived and breathed when I was in UN Habitat, and they do it so well. So the accountability is there for us, you know, as the practitioners, but NGOs also have to realize that they have to show up. They have to show up, and they have to be able to partner amongst themselves within their own constituency. There's no time for competition. There's enough room in the pie for everybody. So again, these are difficult times with COVID-19. Again, as we said, it's allowed us to really think differently. And, you know, in crisis, we come up with brilliant ideas. I was reading the speech of the executive director of UN Habitat, where she was bringing to light that cities and towns were so quick to make changes and to put measures into place to address the pandemic, whether it was emergency housing solutions, providing shelter for the homeless, or maybe even spaces to quarantine. But what we have to ensure is that long after a vaccine has been found, we have to be sure that within our respective quarters, we make sure these measures that have been put into place with the support and with the input of stakeholders remain in place. It would be a shame if these achievements are just, you know, reserved for the pandemic, and then we move along when they're done. As the executive director said, these measures have to lead to long-term policy changes after the pandemic is over. So for me, you know, partnership is multidimensional between all of us, whether it's governments, local authorities, private sector, civil society, and it's crucial that it has to be this way if we are going to make strides to implement the new urban agenda. So let's all continue to work together. Let's force the cooperation. Let's provide adequate spaces for the most vulnerable, and really encourage everyone to continue being messengers of the urban agenda for people's well-being, healthy, and for their dignity. Thanks so much for having me on this platform. I look forward to talking more during the question and answer. I want to thank Krishnan, who's my former boss, who's involved in here. Everything I have learned is a foundation of UN Habitat. I'm so happy to really be on this platform and to share this time with you. Thanks again. Over.
Okay, thanks very much, Hawa. I'm very sensitive to the time right now because we're going over. We have some panelist responders, I think. I just checked the participation list, and I think we have Douglas here, Alfonso, and Fatima. I didn't see Linda in the room, but I'm going to ask, I'm just going to suggest maybe some issues that people might like to respond to. So first of all, any positive examples of local government and civil society innovative approaches that can bring diverse voices into the room. Any characteristics of successful inclusion, additional to things we already heard. Key challenges that we haven't yet talked about in terms of implementing policies, and practical approaches for the participation to inform decision making, And I think something that came up is this issue of governance, okay? And often people in positions of power don't want to give that space up. They're very afraid of being held to account. I was an elected politician, so, you know, I know that we can be very attacked. There's lots of trust. So maybe those are some things people might like to talk about. So Douglas, Program Management Officer of UN Habitat, youth development expert, working with marginalized young people. Could you just make a few responses?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'll be quick. And if you can put the PowerPoint up, it's only 3 slides, so I promise not to go long. I guess where I'm coming from, and it's amazing to be here. I really thank you so much to the Urban Economy Forum. It's great to follow Hawa, who I worked with for many years, and basically standing on the shoulders of giants often. She did some amazing work here in Nairobi with the youth program, and then also to have Anantha Krishnan, who was my boss and mentor as well. So I've learned much from them, and what I want to jump in really quickly is just to say what, having done participation work with many marginalized communities, specifically children and youth, but also women, indigenous peoples and so on. I think what we're looking for now is some things that are examples, and as well as was mentioned, what are the qualities of those examples so that we can replicate them. I mean, we're talking about going to scale. So I just wanted to do a quick 3-slide thing. One example of youth engagement and participation in governance and having impact, what's happening during COVID-19 right now. What we're calling a proof of concept. So we had, I don't have to go into the details about COVID-19 and the challenges faced, but and I think what was mentioned by Rashi is that COVID-19 has shone the light on all the inequalities. I mean, everything is laid bare. And actually, for one of the few times globally where all have a lived experience that is quite similar. We've all lost work. We've all, been in really challenging situations in which our health can be challenged. So suddenly I think there's a global empathy that there has never been there before. And so the question for me is, during this really, what I would say, a compressed timeline, like really intensely compressed timeline, what have we learned and what has moved? And what we have learned here in Kenya and East Africa and in other parts of the world is that young people can take a lead if they're engaged meaningfully and if they can participate. So I just wanted to quickly give you 3 slides. What we're calling a proof of concept, youth-led emergency COVID-19. Yeah, next slide, thanks. Next slide, thanks. UN, not one, go by one back, thanks. As Hawa mentioned, our executive director had a really amazing vision. And number 1 part of her vision for the COVID-19 response plan was local governments and community-driven solutions. And that's really what we're looking to find, is those community-driven solutions. And also what this pandemic unleashed and allowed us to look at is informal settlements. There's 1 billion people living in informal settlements. That is the issue of urbanity going forward in the future. Urbans, yes, they're innovative and so on, but it's the 1 billion people who are living there that we've learned about, because this was, when it started, an urban disease. 80% of all cases were in urban centers, and urban centers are still the place that most of them are in. Next. And just quickly, so what happened really, really quickly, when in March, we were approached by one of the groups in Mathari that Hawa has worked with a few years back. And they said, listen, our community is afraid. We need to do something. We don't have any public health resources. We don't have, as Rashi mentioned, we don't have water, we don't have sanitation, so on and so on. What can we do? We think hand washing stations are the first thing. Can we try it? And we said, go for it. Let's do it. We'll follow your lead. And that started off in early March. By mid-April, there were 30 some odd stations cranking out about 5,000 or 6,000 hand washes a day. By August 12th, which was International Youth Day, there was 2 million hand washes done, 93 stations, all run by young people. And I won't say they're the only reason that we didn't have an outbreak here, a really serious outbreak here in East Africa, but they're one of the major reasons that young people here did that. And they didn't just do hand washing, they did masks, they did temperatures, and they're moving into looking at the gender violence, which has spiked everywhere in the world. Children being out of school, what can we do about that? These are young people that really came in and did a public health and then community response. That to me is a proof of concept. That suggests that young people can do this, that youth organizations can do this. And we need to look to those and not just put them forward as just fun, really interesting things, but embed them and engage them fully in our governance systems. So that when, as Rashi was doing, engaging people in planning their informal settlements, that should be the go-to way of doing things. It should not be the thing we do if we have enough money. And that's really what it is. We have to change the locus of power. We need to put the power back into the people's hands, and cities are the place we can do that. Next slide. Anyways, so that's really, like I said, really quick. Some of the presentation's been really, really interesting. I've been messaging, as people know, saying, could you send me your PowerPoint? It would be great for the organizers to put the PowerPoints up in a Google folder. I think this is a really important trend, and especially something called the Urban Economy Forum, which often leaves out those most marginalized, the people who really are the economy, the people who are the ones taking it on the chin right now during COVID. It's not the big multinational corporations that are folding, it's the small businesses. And we need to make sure that we change the economy. We need to go back to the roots of economy. We need to go back and find out what we need to do to rejig an economy which serves the masses of the people and not just the elite, the 1%. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. That was great. I'm going to ask Alfonso now to speak. He's Executive Director of Agriculture Without Borders, which sounds fascinating. So, Alfonso, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first, one comment is actually architecture. Architects Without Borders in Norway. So it's not agriculture. Hopefully not many disappointing people there with this change. My comment goes towards the projects we work with. It's mainly to help in long-term communities with living buildings, educational buildings, health centers, and our entire process is very similar to what Circe has gone through. It's in a completely different environment, but we have projects in Argentina, in Laos, in Kenya, and here in Norway. And it's been very similar to what Circe presented, how we get the people involved. And when we get the community to be part of this process, when they through the entire process of the design of an architectural building, they get this ownership and they are more interested, and the building is used in a proper way. So, for example, in the project in Argentina, for us to accomplish this, we had a local architect and a local sociologist, which visit the site of the project, and they got together with the community. And one of the projects was in the north of Argentina, which was with an indigenous community, to give them a space for them to pass down the knowledge of these handcrafts they produce. So they went there and they spent a week with them, and they learned what they were truly needs, what we shouldn't avoid. We learned, for example, that they don't like glass in their buildings, which for us as an architect and living here in Norway, that the window is glass, and it's very common. Or, for example, that they don't want to have the toilets in the same structure as the remaining of the building. So we have to build that aside. So this process, them being a part of the whole process, every time we produce something, it was sent to the sociologist and the architect, and they will meet together with the community, and they explain the project, and they give comments back of what will work, what they will work, what they will expect. It helps our project greatly, and also what Circe says, to make it fun. Some of the projects they got together, and through the entire process of them being part of it, then we have meetings, we have dinners, and they feel this more ownership, and they have more interest in how they can help. One of the projects in another of the projects in one of the cities here in Norway, it was to include the refugees. They've been marginalized and they didn't have much to do. They arrived to the country and then stay in these centers. So then one of the projects was to give them space where they could get together. It started as a point. The point wasn't the space, but the point was the process. So then we brought together all these refugees with different experiences. They were carpenters, electricians, even architects. And they got together and they designed this space and they start building it. The city gave us this space. And then the community around it, the locals, seeing that the refugees were working on this, they got interested and started approaching and they started joining. So then it became a project of the entire community. And towards the end of the project, it also became a showroom for all these refugees, so they could show what they could do. The carpenter can show all his craftsmanship, all his abilities. So it's these points that, of course, we work in a much smaller scale, but the main point is to not marginalize the local knowledge. We always count on that. We are basic for the development of our projects, and to keep them involved in the entire process. Not just arrive as, yeah, we're the architects, we know what we're doing. We don't know what we're doing. We just try to help with the process because we have the tools here that they might not have there. So our point is to give these tools for them to move forward. I think this is more, keep it short because we see we're well over time. That's what I wanted to share with you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I think you've emphasized some things that were already said before, particularly about fun involving children and the importance of local knowledge. I have one more speaker, which is Fatima Saya, Manager of Community Partnerships at the Daniels Corporation. So Fatima, if you are able to just in a couple of minutes make a short response, I would appreciate that.
Sure, I'll do my very best to keep this short. I know that we're very tight on time. So, I think that there's two main things that I want to touch on really briefly, and I'll go through them quickly, but just to give you a little bit of background. So I work with the Daniels Corporation, which is a developer builder in Toronto that builds in sort of the greater Toronto area in Ontario, Canada. And Daniels has been the development partner for phase 1, 2, and 3 of the revitalization of Regent Park, from a 69-acre exclusively social housing neighborhood to a mixed income, mixed use community. And, I think two main threads for me really stood out through the presentations. And the first is participation being really important to design and planning. And the second is participation through the economy as well, being really important to creating local economic development. So, for the first point, design and planning, Circe, Rashi, and Alfonso, touched on this, and it's been a really important part of designing public spaces in Regent Park, as in particular, in our case as well. It's been our experience that public participation is really important. So there's two sort of areas where that's been important, and it's in designing, those two main public spaces, one being the big park, or what's sometimes called Regent Park, and the Regent Park athletic grounds. And in fact, the park was developed or designed and created prior to the athletic grounds, and the athletic grounds were really a response to everything that the community wanted, but couldn't necessarily fit into the big park, right? So this idea that coming together with the community, including members who are of the community who live in social housing, but also new additions to the community, children, women, of course, in Toronto, as is the case in a lot of other major cities, folks living in social housing tend to be more racialized, obviously lower income, and so it really did include a sort of a broad spectrum of the community in that way. And coming together and really trying to understand what it is that they are looking to see, right? Things like a bake oven, things like, open park space, things like actual playground space, and being able to respond to those needs. And then going back and having that feedback and listening to the community when they say, hey, but where are we supposed to play cricket? Right? And understanding that there are sometimes these multiple needs that the community has, that different maybe segments of the community have. But in really listening and eliciting that participation is really how we can find ways to incorporate all of those spaces into a community. And really understanding as well that arts and culture and recreation space are just so important as well to creating that social cohesion that comes afterwards, right? So with the park, for example, bake oven, this bake oven space has become a real center of the community and community markets and events. There's one called the Taste of Regent Park, which really brings together different parts of the community, and they bake cookies and pizza and a bunch of different things in the community bake oven, and it just creates opportunities for folks to come together. And the more participation there is in the process, the easier it is for multiple segments of the community, especially when we're talking about a mixed income community where one of the goals is social cohesion and integration, for all of those groups to feel like they have a place to come together in. And then I think the second bit is really around local economic development, and that's something that we've really focused on as well in many ways. And what I think we've really learned, and this is sort of mirrored in what folks are talking about today, is that participation is different for different folks. And we really adapted our local economic development initiatives successfully, I think, by being responsive to that and being flexible. So in the first sort of part of our local economic development strategy, there's a lot of focus on jobs, job creation, right? All of this development is happening: construction jobs, architecture jobs, design jobs, finding jobs for members of the community that are going through this revitalization process, so they can participate in sort of the economic development that's coming out of that revitalization. But as we've moved on, there's really a recognition that there are some folks who don't necessarily have the training or skills to enter the labor market. Maybe they're further from the labor market. So it's sort of adapting and saying, okay, kind of hearing that from the community, creating those programs and participation with the different social service agencies and city agencies that we work with. And then even thinking further when we hear from the community, like, I don't need a 9-to-5. I'm an artist. Why don't you buy my artwork and put it into the buildings? And just thinking about, okay, there are different ways that folks can participate. We have to be flexible in creating those opportunities for folks to participate. And that's really what participation enables, right? Participation in those discussions enables this fuller participation in sort of the economy that surrounds folks. So those are the two main things that came out of this for me, and really has just given me a really great understanding of how participation, we think of it as something that's maybe in the development perspective clear in design, but in the economy it's been something really important for our work as well.
Thank you so much, Fatima, and I can really vouch for the inspiration that Regent Park represents. I had the privilege of going on the visit last year, and so let's hope we can all be there soon together rather than online. I'm going to close this session. I should just say it was really, really cool that you talked about food and also about the importance of arts and culture and artists being able to make a living. We know that in this terrible pandemic that the artists have really, really suffered. Arts and the creative and cultural industries have been one of the most necessary, but also one of the most under pressure. And I really appreciate what the Daniels Corporation does to support artists. So thanks everybody for your incredible contributions. I've got pages and pages of amazing notes, and I'll be contributing these. Okay, and hope to see you all in real time sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Lovely meeting. Alla igen, Gustav.
Ha det, Krishnan.
Vi snackes, det känns bra.
Vi snackes, ja. Absolut. Ha det bra.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if Evan is Evan